Hi everyone, this is Unit 7, Lecture 5B. We're talking all about the Russian Revolution. We talked last lecture about Lenin coming to power as a totalitarian leader, and today we're going to talk all about his successor, a man named Joseph Stalin. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about Stalin's rule starting in 1924. All right, well, Stalin was known for something called Russification. Russification. It's spelled just like, it looks almost like Russia, but it's Russification. So this basically means that he promoted everything that was ethnically Russian. See, the Soviet Union was made up of hundreds of different ethnic and cultural groups. Stalin showed favoritism towards the dominant ethnic group, Russian. He promoted Russian history, language, culture, and he forbid people from practicing their native languages. He also made sure that only ethnic Russians were appointed to the most important government positions, and he gave them the best jobs in his regime. He also redrew geographic boundaries to make it appear that Russia was the largest province in the Soviet Union. Stalin was also known for his extreme paranoia. It means that you think things are happening that actually are not, or you think that others are plotting against you in order to hurt you, but they're not. It's all in your head. Well, because Stalin was so paranoid, he accused thousands of people, including his closest friends and family members, of crimes against the government. He launched a period of time in the USSR that became known as the Great Purge, in which he accused people, put them on trial, and then let the nation see this trial on TV at the time when this eventually happened, and also via radio. And the result of this Great Purge, well, people were shipped off to gulag prisons in Siberia for their lifetime, or they were executed, very often for crimes that they had not committed. Consequently, people became afraid to speak out against Stalin, and he was surrounded by adoring sycophants who told him exactly what he wanted to hear.
Why should Caesar get to stomp around like a giant while the rest of us try not to get smushed under his big feet? What's so great about Caesar? Brutus is just as cute as Caesar. Okay, Brutus is just as smart as Caesar. People totally like Brutus just as much as they like Caesar. And when did it become okay for one person to be the boss of everybody?
So let's review. Russia became the Soviet Union. They were first led by Lenin and later by Stalin. The Soviet Union had a command economy. Under a command economy, who makes the decisions? The government. Stalin and his government, or Central Planning Committee, made all of the country's economic decisions. Communism is based on the ideas of Karl Marx, the 19th century economic philosopher. However, even though Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union, most people were still poor. They still had a very low standard of living. With a command economy, people were not motivated to produce goods of high quality. This is one of the fundamental reasons why it's extremely difficult to get communism to actually work anywhere. Stalin was also known for collectivization of land and farms. Remember how Lenin redistributed the land to the peasants? Well, Stalin took it all back again. Collectivization means that the government controlled all farms and industry. Peasants were forced to move to big Soviet farms called collectives or collective farms. Remember Mao in China? He did a very similar thing during the Great Leap Forward. Yeah, except in China, their collective farms were called commune farms or communes. Just saying. Anyway, on collective farms, the government owns all the tractors, crops, animals, etc. Many peasants were super peeved about this development, and they would initially sabotage production lines, or they would refuse to hand over crops to the government. Stalin didn't put up with this type of rebellion. Punishment was fierce and swift. Some peasants who refused to move to big state farms were the kulaks. The kulaks. Okay? The kulaks were Ukrainian landowners, and they refused to give in to Stalin. I'm seeing a similarity here with all the stuff that's happening in Crimea lately in Ukraine versus Russia. Wow, this is Stalin, Russian, Russification against the Ukrainians. Interesting. Anyway, the kulaks, these Ukrainian landowners, they actually refused to give in to Stalin, and they, for a few years, grew only enough food for themselves, and they wouldn't give it to the government. So what did Stalin do? Well, the result was that Stalin had his soldiers and troops sent in to seize all of the food or grain, and at least 2 million people starved to death in the Ukraine as a result. And he let it happen. This is called a forced famine, and today we have another word for that. It's called a genocide. Stalin was also known for his 5-year plans to industrialize his nation. Stalin's plans to modernize the Soviet Union and catch up with the West, in other words, the U.S., it's starting in 1945, we're going to see the Soviet Union embroiled in what became known as the Cold War, so stay tuned. Anyway, under Stalin's 5-year plan to industrialize, all of the nation's wealth was to be spent on industry instead of consumer products and goods. Consumer products are things like butter, eggs, shoes, cars. So there were always shortages of basic necessities for people in the Soviet Union and long waits for larger items like cars. The last thing I'd like to do in this lecture is to summarize how totalitarian leaders attempt to exert total control over their people. And I will also provide a comparison of both Stalin and Lenin as well. All right, so let's look first at totalitarian leaders and what life is like in a totalitarian state. How do people live? Well, in terms of economics, there's an increased growth of industry and an increased growth of agriculture. In a communist totalitarian state, there's generally a low standard of living and frequent shortages of food and consumer goods. In terms of politics, in any totalitarian regime, there's a one-party dictatorship, meaning only one political party is allowed. And if other parties are allowed, they really are just there for show and for the main political party. There's a total political control over all citizens and total government control of industry and farming. So it is a communist totalitarian state. The government frequently uses propaganda to win the public support. Additionally, in a totalitarian state, in terms of the arts in society, there's generally a censorship of books, music, and art. All art, music, books, they must be approved by the government before they can be published. I mean, if you're a totalitarian leader, you only want people to see what you want them to see. In the totalitarian USSR, the purpose of art was to praise communism. And there was frequent surveillance of artists, writers, and musicians by a secret police force, just to make sure people were staying in line. Religion in most totalitarian states, but especially in communist totalitarian states like the USSR, this means that there's a government war on religion. The government is going to monitor all houses of worship, and they will have a secret police that controls religious worship. Totalitarian states, ideally, they're going to replace religious ideals with communist ideals. In society, there's a constant fear of the secret police. And in a communist totalitarian state, one frequently sees the emergence of an upper class or elite class of Communist Party members who live much better than others, with special housing and privileges. The advantages of most totalitarian states is that, everyone has health care and free education. There are public parks that are created and a lot of recreational opportunities. And in many totalitarian societies, there are increased rights for women, and there's more government support for women. So the bottom line, the purpose of society or a totalitarian society is to honor the government. Totalitarian leaders will do whatever it takes to stay in power, even if that means suppressing people's rights or making people live in constant fear. Totalitarian regimes are Machiavellian in nature. Remember, it's better to be feared than loved. This really fits in right here. All right, well, both Lenin, who was the first leader of the USSR, and Stalin, the second leader of the USSR, are considered to be communist totalitarian leaders, but they had their differences. So you might want to make a Venn diagram in your notes right now so we can compare these two individuals. Lenin led the USSR from 1917 to 1924. His goal was to create a classless society with the production in the people's hands. He actually did allow for some private businesses. Under Lenin, people had increased land ownership and higher standards of living. One could say that he was less totalitarian than his successor, Stalin. Stalin, on the other hand, who was the leader of the USSR from 1924 to 1953, was the epitome of a totalitarian leader. His primary goal was to build industry. Under Stalin, the government truly controlled everything. Stalin created a command economy. All farming fell under state control. All industry was controlled by the government. All economic decisions were made by the government for the people. There was no more private business or farming. In fact, all farming fell under state control, which meant that the land reforms Lenin had made, which granted peasants private land ownership, were taken away by Stalin. Farmers were forced to move to large collective farms. Ultimately, although Stalin industrialized his nation, the standard of living fell for most people. Both Lenin and Stalin did share certain experiences. Both men spent time in prison when the Tsar had still been in power. Both were communist or Bolshevik leaders. And both men were totalitarian in that they used secret police forces. Both men wanted a communist revolution. However, both men had very different methods for achieving their goals. So in summary, Russia will go from having an absolute monarch called a Tsar to having a communist totalitarian leader named Stalin by 1924. We're also going to see totalitarianism becoming very attractive to people in other parts of Europe as well, namely Germany and Italy, where we're going to see something called fascist totalitarianism emerge. But more on that later. Thanks for listening. Bye.